Chapter 1: The Procession of Simulacra. Jean Baudrillard's The Procession of Simulacra begins with the striking allegory of Bourget's map, which depicts a map so perfect that it covers the entire territory it represents. Over time, as the empire decays, the map disintegrates and fragments, leaving traces scattered in the desert. For Baudrillard, this story is no longer a romantic metaphor for representation, but rather a starting point to understand how, in modernity, representation no longer relates to a real referent. It overtakes it entirely. We no longer live in an age of reflection or distortion of reality. Instead, we live in an age of simulation, where models produce what we perceive as reality, creating what Baudrillard calls hyperreality. Baudrillard distinguishes between different phases of the image. First, it reflects a profound reality. Second, it masks and distorts reality. Third, it masks the absence of reality. And fourth, it bears no relation to any reality whatsoever, becoming its own pure simulacrum. These phases signal a shift from representations that refer to an original reality to simulations that create their own truth, independent of any origin. In the contemporary era, we have reached the fourth phase. We now deal with signs that signify only other signs, endlessly referring back to themselves rather than to something real behind them. He introduces the idea of simulation as fundamentally different from dissimulation. While dissimulation involves concealing something that exists, simulation involves feigning what does not exist at all. In this process, the difference between true and false, real and imaginary, collapses. He illustrates this with the example of a person pretending to be sick, dissimulating, versus someone who simulates sickness so convincingly that it becomes indistinguishable from a genuine illness. The simulated symptoms are real, yet the illness is not truly present. The impossibility of separating the authentic from the inauthentic dismantles any objective reality. Baudrillard expands this concept to military and psychiatric cases. Traditionally, armies and medical institutions depended on strict distinctions. A soldier is either genuinely unfit or is pretending. A patient is either sick or faking it. Simulation undermines this certainty because the simulator produces real symptoms or behaviors. The system can no longer rely on clear truth, and the boundaries between real and false disintegrate. He further explores religious iconoclasm to show how images have always had a dangerous power to obscure or replace the divine. The iconoclasts destroyed religious images not because they denied God, but because they feared that images might reveal that there was never a God behind them, that images themselves might be all there is. Baudrillard argues that our culture today functions similarly. Images and signs no longer veil or distort a deeper truth. They constitute the entire substance of reality. We do not peel back images to reveal truth underneath. Rather, there is nothing but a continuous interplay of images. This progression leads to the idea of hyperreality, a state where reality is replaced by models or simulations that seem more real than reality itself. In hyperreality, distinctions such as true, false, or real, imaginary no longer hold meaning. Baudrillard provides compelling examples to illustrate this. One of the most striking is Disneyland. Disneyland is presented as imaginary, as a fantasy world that offers an escape from reality. However, its function is not simply to entertain, but to conceal that the real America outside Disneyland has itself become a simulation. Disneyland operates as a mechanism of ideological reassurance, maintaining the illusion that there is a real, authentic world beyond its gates, when in fact, according to Baudrillard, all of America is part of the same hyperreal order. Similarly, he discusses Watergate as an example of how scandal serves as a simulation. Rather than exposing corruption to reinforce morality, Watergate's function was to simulate political morality itself. By creating the image of scandal and moral outrage, the system restores belief in political transparency and justice. The spectacle of scandal hides the fact that power structures function independently of morality or transparency. Instead of undermining faith in the system, such spectacles reinforce it. Baudrillard deepens his analysis of hyperreality by extending the discussion to nuclear deterrence. In the nuclear age, deterrence itself becomes a simulation. Rather than preventing real war through mutual fear, it functions as a system of signs intended to maintain an illusion of strategic balance. Nuclear arsenals, though material, are never meant to be used. They signify power rather than enact it. The threat of mutual destruction creates a scenario where the reality of war disappears into the simulation of perpetual readiness. Deterrence thus becomes an operational code in the hyper-real system, reinforcing the logic that power is not exercised through actual conflict, but through the controlled management of its possibility. In this context, Baudrillard describes an implosion rather than an explosion of meaning. Traditional political and social structures depended on clear oppositions and dialectical tensions, left versus right, power versus counterpower, repression versus liberation. In hyperreality, these oppositions implode into each other. The media does not expose or challenge power, but absorbs and neutralizes it through constant circulation of images and scandals. The system no longer needs to repress because everything is already included, integrated, and simulated. Media serves as a prime example of this process. Once thought of as a medium for communication and truth-telling, it becomes a closed circuit of signs referring only to other signs. News no longer informs citizens about objective events, but generates an endless loop of references, emotional triggers, and spectacle. Events are produced to sustain the media system, and the audience is transformed from active citizens to passive consumers of signs. This endless commentary and feedback reinforce hyperreality rather than breaking through it. The same principle applies to politics. Modern politics is no longer the field where genuine social conflicts are played out, but a simulation stage where scripted conflicts give the illusion of choice and democratic engagement. Elections, debates, and public controversies serve as rituals to reaffirm the system's legitimacy. Baudrillard claims that politics becomes indistinguishable from advertising. Both rely on images, slogans, and manipulative spectacle rather than substance. The collapse of ideology does not lead to liberation, but to the total saturation of meaning and the impossibility of any alternative. The collapse of the social into hyperreality also entails the disappearance of genuine social relations. The social is no longer about living together, collective values, or shared experiences. Instead, it dissolves into networks of communication that simulate connection while fragmenting individuals. Society becomes a code to be managed, surveyed, and reproduced, rather than a dynamic field of interaction and solidarity. Baudrillard highlights the transition from the panopticon model, where surveillance is centralized and power operates by watching the many from a single point, to a diffused, networked form of control. In the hyper-real age, power does not need to watch from a tower. Instead, individuals internalize the codes of behavior, willingly sharing information and participating in systems of self-surveillance. Social media and digital networks later realized this dynamic to an extreme degree, though Baudrillard foresaw it decades earlier. He describes this shift as the end of the social, where collective institutions no longer serve as sites of resistance or community, but are absorbed into the logic of operational control. Resistance itself is anticipated and integrated into the system, neutralizing any possibility of true opposition. Even critique becomes part of the simulation, harmlessly expressed, commodified, and rendered ineffective. In this landscape, Baudrillard suggests that the real is no longer recoverable. Attempts to return to an authentic real through movements, protests, or truth-telling campaigns become additional signs within the system. They are quickly assimilated into the logic of simulation, losing their critical edge. Reality becomes an operational effect, a programmed result, rather than an independent state of existence. Baudrillard introduces the concept of the strategy of the real, a desperate attempt by institutions and individuals to reassert the existence of a tangible reality. Yet these efforts fail precisely because they are based on the logic of production and representation, which already belongs to the hyper-real system. By trying to prove reality through metrics, evidence, and images, we reinforce its disappearance. These proofs function as signs, among other signs, contributing to the overall circulation rather than providing grounding. As Baudrillard advances toward the culmination of his argument, he describes the final collapse of distinctions between true and false, between reality and its representation. In hyperreality, these dualities are no longer meaningful. They dissolve into an endless play of signs. The system no longer requires ideology to mask its functioning, as everything, including opposition, has been subsumed into the logic of simulation. Ideology once depended on a distinction between truth and lies, authentic and false consciousness. Simulation transcends this dichotomy entirely. Baudrillard claims that repression has been replaced by a model of operational control. In traditional societies, power functioned through prohibitions, censorship, and surveillance aimed at keeping certain truths hidden. In hyperreality, power operates instead by producing endless transparency, flooding society with so much information and so many images that meaning itself evaporates. This strategy does not hide or repress. It renders meaning obsolete through saturation. Symbols, once carriers of ritual significance and collective meaning, are stripped of their power. The loss of symbolic exchange signifies the loss of authentic community, as well as the death of collective imagination. Traditional symbolic acts, sacrifice, gift-giving, communal rituals establish social bonds and structured reality. Their disappearance mirrors the collapse of the social into networks of simulation and code. Without symbolic exchange, society becomes a flat system of operational functions, devoid of depth and resonance. Baudrillard introduces the notion of implosion, a key metaphor throughout this chapter. Rather than an explosive event that breaks structures apart, implosion refers to the inward collapse of meaning as signs and images fold in on themselves. Implosion absorbs all opposition, critique, and difference, leaving behind a smooth surface of continuous circulation. Under this condition, even acts of resistance become performances, serving to maintain the illusion of vitality in a system that has long ceased to be alive in any symbolic sense. This condition of implosion is also evident in media. The media's supposed interactivity and multiplicity of voices give the impression of democratic openness, but in reality they dissolve agency. Participation becomes another layer of simulation. People believe they are engaged and informed, yet they merely reproduce and circulate prefabricated signs. The effect is not empowerment but deeper integration into the system's operational logic. Baudrillard criticizes not only the structures of power but also the failure of critical theory and Marxism to confront simulation effectively. Traditional critiques rely on revealing hidden truths and exposing ideological manipulation. However, in a system of pure simulation, there are no hidden truths to uncover. There is no real to contrast with the false. Attempts to critique the system by unmasking it become futile because there is no mask, only an infinite interplay of surfaces. He asserts that the era of revolution and radical politics has been absorbed into the same simulacral logic. Revolutionary acts and subversions are anticipated, commodified, and ultimately neutralized. Once a countercultural symbol is introduced, it is rapidly integrated into the code and sold back to society as a sign of difference, thus eliminating its critical potential. What appears to be radical or oppositional becomes yet another product, another momentary sign in the flux. In his final reflections, Baudrillard suggests that the disappearance of the real is not merely a cultural phenomenon, but an ontological transformation. The world itself becomes a virtual construction, a total simulation without depth, origin, or final meaning. Human experience, once anchored in shared symbols and stable references, is now adrift in an endless network of self-referential signs. He warns that by attempting to reassert the real through proofs, measurements, and hyperdocumentation, we do not regain authenticity, but rather deepen the simulation. Proofs and records become part of the system of signs rather than anchors to a lost reality. The more we strive to validate the real, the more it recedes into the simulated horizon. Baudrillard's closing vision is stark and unsettling. In hyperreality, nothing lies beyond the code. There is no external point of critique or escape. We exist within the play of simulacra, and even our attempts to transcend or critique this condition are already accounted for, already anticipated by the system. The death of the real thus implies not only the loss of truth, but the end of meaning, agency, and the symbolic dimension of human life. Baudrillard continues to explore the ultimate consequences of the triumph of simulation over reality, pointing to the symbolic death that pervades contemporary existence. In traditional societies, death had a powerful symbolic function. It was a communal event, a marker of passage, and a reaffirmation of social bonds. In hyperreality, death is sanitized, hidden, and transformed into a spectacle. It is no longer an experience to be shared, but a statistic to be managed or an image to be consumed. This transformation exemplifies the broader process by which all human experiences lose depth and become part of a smooth, operational system of signs. The loss of symbolic exchange extends to human subjectivity. The individual, once thought of as a unique subject with an interiority and depth, becomes a node in a network, reduced to data points, preferences, and consumer choices. Identity becomes a construct of signs and simulations, continuously reshaped and remarketed. People become their profiles, their public images, and their media representations, severing any tie to an authentic core or stable self. Baudrillard asserts that in such a system, difference itself is absorbed and neutralized. The production of difference is essential to the functioning of capitalist and post-capitalist societies. It fuels consumption, novelty, and market segmentation. Yet these differences are superficial and endlessly interchangeable. They do not represent true alterity or opposition. The system thrives on a regulated play of differences that ultimately reinforces its unity. Real antagonism, genuine conflict that might destabilize or transform the system, is impossible because all gestures of defiance are quickly transformed into marketable signs. Resistance, then, becomes not just difficult, but structurally impossible. Any attempt at subversion is already anticipated and pre-integrated into the system of simulation. Artistic movements, political protests, and even theoretical critiques are immediately commodified, turned into products or spectacles that reaffirm the logic of hyperreality. Baudrillard suggests that this is not merely a cynical co-option, but a fundamental feature of a society governed by simulation. He discusses the role of recycling in culture as a metaphor for this condition. Just as physical materials are recycled to avoid waste, cultural signs and gestures are endlessly reprocessed and repackaged to sustain the circulation of meaning without generating any true rupture or innovation. Nostalgia itself becomes a product, a simulated return to lost authenticity that paradoxically deepens the hold of simulation. At the heart of Baudrillard's argument is a philosophical confrontation with meaning itself. In hyperreality, meaning is no longer something to be discovered, interpreted, or struggled for. It is manufactured, distributed, and consumed. This inversion strips existence of its existential depth and transforms life into a performance without a script beyond operational codes. Ethics, too, collapses under this regime. Traditional ethics relies on the capacity to make authentic choices, to act in relation to a shared reality and a community of others. In hyperreality, action becomes simulation, choice becomes a menu of pre-configured options, and morality becomes a matter of optics and brand alignment rather than a lived commitment. The distinction between ethical and unethical collapses into questions of visibility and representation. Baudrillard concludes with a radical implication, that there is no longer an outside to appeal to, no external standard or reality against which to measure or resist the system. Hyperreality engulfs everything. It is both the medium and the message, the territory and the map. Attempts to exit the system, to reclaim authenticity or truth, only lead further into the labyrinth of signs. The more fervently one tries to resist, the more deeply one is captured by the logic of simulation. His final vision is one of profound melancholy, but also cold lucidity. We live in a world of floating signs and empty reference, a world that has outstripped all traditional metaphysics, politics, and ethics. While this might seem nihilistic, Baudrillard frames it as a challenge, to think beyond the categories of truth and falsehood, beyond the politics of liberation and repression, and to confront the radical uncertainty and indeterminacy at the heart of existence in hyperreality. In this way, the procession of simulacra does not merely diagnose a cultural condition. It poses a philosophical question about the possibility of meaning, agency, and reality itself. Baudrillard invites us to see that what we perceive as reality is a carefully orchestrated dance of signs, that our sense of self and our moral compass are deeply embedded in this dance, and that stepping outside it might be impossible, or at least unimaginably difficult. The challenge is not to unmask reality, for there is no mask left, but to reckon with a world where simulation has supplanted everything. Chapter 2. A Retro Scenario. In a retro scenario, Jean Baudrillard explores the cultural fascination with the past and the phenomenon of retro aesthetics in contemporary society. He examines why modern culture constantly turns back to earlier eras, resurrecting old styles, images, and sensibilities instead of creating genuinely new forms. For Baudrillard, this obsession with the past is not a sign of nostalgia in the traditional sense, but rather a symptom of a deeper cultural condition tied to simulation and the loss of historical continuity. Baudrillard argues that in a fully saturated media landscape, where everything is instantaneously circulated and consumed, there is no longer room for linear historical progression. History no longer unfolds as a continuous narrative. Instead, it fragments and collapses into a series of recycled signs. This recycling of the past is not about faithfully recovering historical truth, but about producing stylized versions of history that can be consumed in the present. Retro culture, then, is not a revival of authentic historical forms, but a simulacrum of history, an endless play of images and references detached from any real historical foundation. The retro trend demonstrates the impossibility of the new. Baudrillard suggests that in a world dominated by simulation, the idea of true innovation becomes obsolete. Cultural production becomes a process of recombination and citation rather than genuine creation. By endlessly reusing and recontextualizing past styles, society stages a continuous reanimation of dead forms, creating the illusion of creativity while actually avoiding any break with established codes. Retro thus functions as a strategy for dealing with the anxiety of originality's impossibility. He extends this argument by noting that retro is not limited to fashion or music, but pervades all areas of cultural production, including architecture, design, film, and politics. Historical periods are mined for their surface effects, their aesthetic signatures, rather than their substantive ideas or values. Buildings mimic classical or modernist styles without embracing their social or philosophical underpinnings. Films set in past decades rely on stereotypical details to evoke a period feel rather than to interrogate historical realities. Politics may adopt rhetorical gestures from revolutionary moments without carrying forward their transformative spirit. According to Baudrillard, this retro scenario exemplifies the logic of simulation because it trades depth and historical context for surface effects and immediate recognizability. By circulating these emptied-out images of the past, society maintains a perpetual present, an eternal now in which history becomes a series of interchangeable styles and commodities. The past becomes just another theme to be sampled and sold, no different from any other consumer good. This reduction of history to aesthetic play also impacts collective memory. Instead of anchoring social identity in shared historical struggles or achievements, collective memory becomes a fragmented mosaic of nostalgic references. Events and movements that once had profound social significance are reduced to costume parties, vintage collections, and marketing hooks. The political dimension of memory is erased, leaving only stylized souvenirs of what once was. Baudrillard sees this as a form of cultural amnesia, masquerading as remembrance. Moreover, he warns that this fascination with the past conceals the contemporary void of meaning and direction. By constantly invoking and replaying past forms, society distracts itself from confronting its own lack of substantive goals or visions for the future. The retro scenario is thus both a symptom and a defense mechanism. It reflects cultural exhaustion and serves to soothe the anxiety of living without a real horizon of progress or utopia. Baudrillard's diagnosis is not merely pessimistic, but critical. He suggests that the retro scenario reveals the extent to which culture has become autonomous from historical reality, operating purely according to the logic of the sign. It underscores the final victory of simulation over history. The past is not revived, but simulated, and in this simulation, both history and originality dissolve. In sum, a retro scenario is Baudrillard's sharp critique of how contemporary society consumes history as style rather than substance. Retro culture epitomizes the triumph of simulacra over reality, the substitution of historical meaning with surface aesthetics, and the ultimate transformation of history into a playful but hollow playground of signs. Chapter 3: Holocaust. In Holocaust, the philosopher addresses the representation of mass extermination, particularly focusing on how the Holocaust has been absorbed into the regime of simulation. He challenges the idea that showing the horror of the Holocaust through images and narratives can serve as an authentic testimony or moral lesson. Instead, he argues that representing such events through media necessarily transforms them into simulacra, stripping them of their singular horror and reducing them to elements within the circulation of signs. Baudrillard begins by questioning whether it is possible or even desirable to represent the Holocaust at all. He suggests that the event is beyond representation, existing as an absolute limit event that defies conventional narrative and image-based mediation. Attempts to portray it, whether through film, photography, or even survivor testimony, risk trivializing its enormity by forcing it into familiar narrative frameworks and aesthetic codes. One of Baudrillard's most provocative points is that the multiplication of images and testimonies does not necessarily preserve memory. Rather, it can lead to a kind of amnesia. When the Holocaust is endlessly replayed in films, documentaries, and exhibitions, it becomes part of a media cycle, consumed in the same way as entertainment. The original event's unthinkable reality is overshadowed by its endless reproduction, leading to what Baudrillard calls the atrophy of experience. Instead of a deep, collective confrontation with historical guilt and responsibility, there emerges a superficial engagement that is easily integrated into the consumer logic of media. He argues that in contemporary culture, even the most horrifying realities must pass through the regime of the sign to be acknowledged. In this process, they lose their radical singularity and are transformed into another message among many. The Holocaust then becomes a hyperreal object, more present in its representation than in its historical reality. This transformation shifts focus from the actual horror to its mediated form, from ethical and political engagement to passive consumption. Baudrillard also discusses the ways in which the Holocaust is used ideologically. By framing it as the ultimate evil, society reaffirms its moral framework and sense of righteousness. The event becomes an absolute reference point against which all other evils are measured. In doing so, the Holocaust paradoxically serves to stabilize moral codes rather than challenge them. Its representation, thus, contributes to the maintenance of social order rather than provoking radical questioning or transformation. Furthermore, he warns that the attempt to show everything, to document every aspect in exhaustive detail, participates in the logic of transparency that he critiques elsewhere. The drive toward total visibility, under the guise of preventing denial or forgetting, ends up dissolving the singularity of the event into an archive of images and data, endlessly analyzable and yet emptied of visceral impact. The moral imperative to never forget risks turning into an operational imperative to always display, feeding the machinery of information rather than fostering true remembrance. In concluding this chapter, Baudrillard underscores the ethical stakes of representation in a culture dominated by simulation. By turning the Holocaust into a reproducible sign, society risks not only misrepresenting it, but fundamentally misunderstanding its historical and moral significance. The event's true horror lies not only in its historical facticity, but also in its capacity to resist assimilation into the circuits of representation and consumption. For Baudrillard, the challenge is to preserve the radical inassimilability of such events, to acknowledge that some realities must remain beyond simulation. In a world obsessed with visibility and transparency, this becomes increasingly difficult, leaving us with representations that comfort rather than confront. Chapter 4: The China Syndrome. In the China Syndrome, the philosopher analyzes the logic of nuclear power and the cultural symbolism of technological catastrophe, using the metaphor of the nuclear meltdown scenario as a window into hyper-reality and simulation. The chapter takes its title from the 1979 film The China Syndrome, which depicted the potential meltdown of a nuclear reactor so severe it could theoretically melt through the Earth to China. Baudrillard interprets this idea not merely as a technological warning, but as a powerful metaphor for how risk, danger, and crisis are simulated and managed in contemporary society. Baudrillard argues that nuclear power embodies a form of controlled danger. The possibility of meltdown is always present, but is systematically contained within elaborate safety mechanisms and discourses of control. This perpetual state of potential catastrophe serves as a way of maintaining a heightened awareness of danger without the actual eruption of disaster. The nuclear reactor becomes a symbol of an endlessly deferred apocalypse, a catastrophe that is both omnipresent and endlessly postponed. This logic mirrors the dynamics of deterrence in the realm of nuclear weapons. Just as nuclear arms exist to prevent war through the threat of total annihilation, nuclear reactors represent the continual management of risk without actual collapse. The threat is real enough to justify immense bureaucratic and technological systems of control, but the ultimate event, the meltdown, is rendered almost unthinkable, relegated to the realm of the hyper-real. It exists more as a symbolic horizon than as an actual future event. Baudrillard points out that this kind of perpetual danger reshapes how society understands safety and risk. Instead of eliminating danger, advanced technological systems institutionalize it, making it an integral part of normalcy. In doing so, the potential catastrophe is not abolished but simulated, turned into a constant presence that structures behavior and thought. Safety becomes a simulation of protection rather than an actual guarantee. The public is encouraged to believe in the infallibility of technological safeguards while remaining haunted by the fantasy of ultimate disaster. The nuclear metaphor also allows Baudrillard to discuss the implosion of meaning. In traditional societies, catastrophes were singular, concrete events with clear causes and effects, and they carried symbolic meaning, divine punishment, moral lessons, etc. In hypermodern society, catastrophe becomes diffuse and omnipresent, losing its singularity and meaning. The idea of meltdown is always circulating in public discourse, creating a collective fascination with collapse, but in a way that neutralizes real political or existential engagement. Baudrillard suggests that the China syndrome represents a symbolic meltdown of social and political structures. Just as a nuclear core can hypothetically melt through the earth, so too can the symbolic order collapse inward, losing all differentiation and coherence. The risk is no longer about actual meltdown, but about the dissolution of meaning and social bonds under the weight of simulation. Moreover, by focusing obsessively on technological dangers and spectacular failures, society avoids confronting more pervasive systemic crises, such as environmental degradation, social inequality, or moral decay, which do not lend themselves as easily to dramatic representation. The simulated catastrophe becomes a diversion, channeling anxiety away from structural problems towards spectacular but manageable threats. In sum, the China syndrome uses the metaphor of nuclear meltdown to illustrate how modern society simulates danger, institutionalizes risk, and absorbs potential catastrophes into a logic of endless deferral. It highlights how even the threat of ultimate disaster can be commodified and circulated as part of the hyperreal system, ultimately serving to reinforce rather than challenge the status quo. Chapter 5: Apocalypse Now. In Apocalypse Now, Baudrillard examines how the concept of apocalypse has been transformed from an actual event into a pervasive cultural simulation. Using the example of the film Apocalypse Now, he explores how war, destruction, and ultimate catastrophe have become aestheticized and turned into hyper-real spectacles, stripping them of authentic horror and political significance. Baudrillard argues that Apocalypse Now does not merely represent the Vietnam War. It transforms it into a cinematic hallucination, a mythical narrative that overshadows historical and political reality. The war becomes an aesthetic object rather than a concrete geopolitical conflict. By turning violence into art, the film transforms the horror of war into something beautiful, immersive, and consumable. The viewer is invited to experience war not as tragedy or political crime, but as a psychedelic journey through a mesmerizing landscape of violence and chaos. He suggests that this aestheticization reflects a broader cultural trend, the transformation of real events into images and signs that circulate independently of any reference to actual circumstances. The apocalypse no longer refers to a final, world-ending event. Instead, it is endlessly replayed, stylized, and consumed in fragments through media. The proliferation of apocalyptic images, whether in film, television, or advertising, creates an environment in which the idea of apocalypse loses its singular power and becomes just another element of entertainment. Baudrillard connects this to the logic of simulation. By continuously staging the apocalypse, society neutralizes its power. The idea of final destruction, rather than inspiring fear or urgency, becomes a spectacle that soothes and fascinates. The endless representation of catastrophe creates a collective immunity to the very idea of disaster. The audience becomes complicit in this transformation, enjoying the simulated destruction as a form of catharsis or thrilling spectacle, rather than confronting its ethical or political implications. He also critiques the supposed truthfulness of such representations. Even when films like Apocalypse Now claim to reveal the truth of war, they participate in the same system of simulation. The attempt to show war in its raw or unfiltered form only reinforces the aesthetic and hyper-real dimensions of violence. By presenting violence as an immersive experience, these representations draw viewers deeper into the logic of consumption, rather than leading to critical reflection or resistance. Baudrillard suggests that this transformation is not confined to film, but extends to all aspects of contemporary life. Apocalypse is no longer a singular future event to be feared. It is an ongoing condition, a background hum that structures collective consciousness. The idea of an ending, of ultimate closure or revelation, has dissolved into a permanent state of crisis. This condition is not experienced as an interruption, but as a normalized, even reassuring, part of daily life. Furthermore, he argues that by simulating apocalypse, society absolves itself of responsibility. The repeated staging of collapse and destruction in media becomes a way to displace anxiety and guilt. Instead of addressing real systemic threats, environmental collapse, political decay, economic inequality, society indulges in virtual apocalypses that serve as safety valves for collective fear. These simulations allow the system to continue functioning without addressing its own self-destructive tendencies. In sum, Apocalypse Now is Baudrillard's exploration of how catastrophe and ultimate destruction are aestheticized, commodified, and integrated into the continuous flow of hyperreal signs. Apocalypse loses its meaning as an endpoint or a rupture. It becomes just another product to be consumed, another spectacle in the endless chain of images that defines hypermodern life. Chapter 6: Implosion and Deterrence. In Implosion and Deterrence, Baudrillard examines how contemporary society moves from a logic of expansion and explosion to a logic of implosion. He argues that in modern media and cultural systems, meaning no longer expands outward to engage or challenge the world. Instead, it collapses inward, creating a closed circuit of self-referential signs. This process of implosion is closely linked to the strategies of deterrence that shape both political and social realities. Baudrillard begins by describing the historical shift from explosion to implosion. In earlier eras, power and information were spread outward, projecting force and ideology into the world. Wars, revolutions, and ideological confrontations operated in this expansive mode. In contrast, contemporary society is dominated by implosion. Information and meaning turn inward, losing external reference and collapsing into dense networks of self-reproducing signs. The media, for Baudrillard, exemplifies this shift most clearly. Rather than transmitting clear messages or engaging in rational discourse, media today functions as an endless loop of signals and images that refer only to each other. This continuous recycling of content creates the illusion of communication and interaction while actually neutralizing real social and political engagement. The public, instead of being mobilized by messages, is pacified and absorbed into the spectacle. Baudrillard introduces the concept of deterrence, not only in the military sense, as with nuclear weapons, but as a general cultural and social strategy. In military terms, deterrence relies on the threat of overwhelming retaliation to prevent conflict. Similarly, in society, deterrence operates by presenting overwhelming flows of information and signs to prevent genuine action or dissent. The threat of information overload deters meaning itself. The result is a society that is constantly stimulated but never mobilized, permanently suspended in a state of virtual possibility without actual consequence. This strategy works by absorbing all opposition, critique, and resistance into the system itself. Even radical ideas and revolutionary movements are anticipated and neutralized by being represented and commodified before they can take concrete form. In this way, the system maintains its stability not through direct repression, but through a kind of symbolic oversaturation. The public sphere becomes a controlled environment where everything can be expressed, but nothing can actually change. Baudrillard also discusses the concept of hyper-real security. In a society governed by deterrence, security is not achieved through actual safety measures, but through the simulation of security. Surveillance systems, endless warnings, and the dramatization of threats serve to create a sense of protective omnipresence. People are kept in a state of passive alertness, more concerned with simulated dangers than real ones. This simulated security prevents any deep questioning of the actual vulnerabilities or contradictions within the system. The implosion of meaning extends to social relations as well. Traditional forms of social solidarity and collective identity collapse under the weight of individualism and mediated experiences. People become isolated nodes in a network, connected by superficial interactions rather than genuine communal bonds. Even personal relationships are mediated through images and signs, transforming intimacy into a series of simulations. The family, community, and workplace no longer function as sites of symbolic exchange, but as parts of an operational matrix designed to reproduce the system. Baudrillard's analysis culminates in a grim observation. By mastering the logic of deterrence and implosion, contemporary society has created a system that is virtually immune to disruption. The system's ability to absorb and neutralize every threat, every idea, and every act of resistance renders it unassailable. Unlike systems of the past, which could be overthrown through revolution or critique, the current regime of signs deflects every challenge by turning it into another sign, another moment of spectacle. In sum, implosion and deterrence lays out Baudrillard's theory of how modern society sustains itself through the collapse of meaning and the simulation of security and participation. Instead of explosion and conflict, we live in an era of implosion, where everything folds inward and any possibility of real transformation is perpetually deferred. Chapter 7. Hypermarket and Hypercommodity. In Hypermarket and Hypercommodity, the author explores the transformation of consumption in postmodern society, focusing on how the hypermarket embodies the logic of hyperreality and simulation. He argues that the traditional market, once a space of exchange and negotiation rooted in real economic and social relationships, has been supplanted by the hypermarket, a space where commodities, signs, and desires collapse into one seamless system. The hypermarket is not merely a large supermarket. It represents a total environment where buying, socializing, entertainment, and symbolic consumption converge. In this space, individuals do not simply purchase goods. They immerse themselves in a totalizing experience that organizes behavior and subjectivity. The hypermarket thus becomes a microcosm of postmodern society, in which the distinction between consumer and citizen, object and sign, real and simulated collapses. Baudrillard suggests that in the hypermarket, commodities lose their original use value and become pure signs. The value of a product is no longer tied to its practical utility, but to its ability to signify status, identity, and lifestyle. Shopping becomes a ritual, a mode of participation in a symbolic economy rather than a practical activity aimed at satisfying needs. The act of consuming is less about acquiring objects than about entering into a system of meanings. Each choice, each brand, each aesthetic gesture signals belonging to certain cultural codes. The hypermarket thus exemplifies the transition from a society of production to a society of consumption and simulation. Where production was once the dominant mode of social organization, focusing on labor and material output, consumption now governs collective life. In this new regime, individuals are interpolated not as workers or producers, but as consumers whose identities are defined by their choices within a marketplace of signs. The hypermarket is the temple of this new form of sociality. Baudrillard extends this analysis to the broader concept of the hypercommodity. In the age of simulation, commodities are no longer discrete items exchanged for money. They are carriers of sign value that circulate within a symbolic system. The hypercommodity does not simply satisfy needs, but organizes desires, dreams, and fantasies. Advertising plays a central role in this transformation by constantly producing new signifiers and reinventing commodities as expressions of freedom, rebellion, sophistication, or authenticity. This logic leads to what Baudrillard describes as a total mobilization of desire. The entire social field becomes saturated with commodities and signs, leaving no outside or residual space for genuine need or resistance. The hypermarket and hypercommodity create a closed circuit in which individuals endlessly pursue satisfaction that is perpetually deferred. The promise of fulfillment keeps consumers moving through aisles and advertisements, but this promise is never truly realized. Instead, desire is continuously regenerated to sustain the system. Baudrillard also discusses how the hypermarket reorganizes physical and social space. It is designed to control movement, guide perception, and orchestrate encounters. The layout of shelves, placement of signs, and flow of people are meticulously calculated to maximize engagement and consumption. The hypermarket is thus an engineered space of seduction, in which freedom of choice is simulated but ultimately governed by the logic of the system. At the same time, the hypermarket functions as a social center, replacing traditional public spaces where genuine community life might unfold. People gather not to exchange ideas or participate in civic life, but to consume together, to share in the collective ritual of shopping. In this sense, the hypermarket represents the culmination of a process in which social relations are dissolved and reconstituted around consumption. In sum, hypermarket and hypercommodity presents a critical examination of how contemporary capitalism has shifted from a focus on production and exchange value to a regime dominated by sign value and symbolic consumption. The hypermarket emerges as the quintessential space of this transformation, embodying the logic of hyperreality, where commodities become signs and consumption becomes the primary mode of social participation. Baudrillard's analysis reveals the deep entanglement of economic, social, and symbolic processes that define postmodern consumer culture. Chapter 8: The Implosion of Meaning in the Media. In The Implosion of Meaning in the Media, the author offers a profound critique of the contemporary media landscape, arguing that the proliferation of messages and information does not enhance meaning but instead leads to its collapse. This implosion refers to the inward collapse of meaning as it becomes oversaturated and absorbed into an endless circuit of self-referential signs. Baudrillard begins by questioning the traditional view that more communication equals more democratic or liberated societies. He suggests that the constant flood of information, images, and signs does not clarify reality but confuses and blurs it. In modern media, there is no longer a clear distinction between true and false, event and non-event, message and noise. This saturation results in a loss of critical distance, making it impossible for individuals to discern authentic signals from the sea of simulacra. He describes this state as an implosion rather than an explosion. Instead of information bursting outward and enlightening the public sphere, it collapses inward, creating a void where meaning used to exist. The sheer volume of circulating signs causes meaning to implode under its own weight, leaving a surface that appears lively and vibrant but is devoid of depth and substance. Baudrillard also explores the disappearance of traditional notions of the public and audience. In classical models, there was a sender, a clear message, and a receiver capable of critical interpretation. In the hyperreal media environment, this model disintegrates. The audience is fragmented into isolated consumers who do not engage in dialogue but passively absorb or bounce signs back into the system. Participation becomes illusory, as individuals are offered endless opportunities to interact without any genuine agency. He critiques the idea of interactivity promoted by mass media and later by digital technologies. The promise of interactivity suggests that individuals have regained control, but Baudrillard argues that this is a simulation of participation rather than real empowerment. Voting in television polls, clicking like, or choosing between pre-formatted options are not acts of democratic expression, but controlled gestures within a pre-structured system. Moreover, Baudrillard contends that the media no longer transmits information about an external reality, but rather produces reality itself as spectacle. Events are not reported so much as they are staged, framed, and scripted to fit narrative demands. The boundary between news and entertainment dissolves, turning even serious crises into consumable stories. Reality television and the continuous coverage of disasters exemplify this process, as they transform human suffering and political conflict into marketable content. Baudrillard suggests that this implosion of meaning leads to a crisis of representation. If all messages are reduced to signs referring only to other signs, then the capacity to represent reality collapses. The media does not distort or hide the truth. It renders the very concept of truth meaningless. In this environment, the notion of critical journalism or authentic reporting becomes impossible because there is no external reality to anchor these practices. He also discusses the idea of noise, a concept borrowed from communication theory, where noise is understood as an interference in the transmission of messages. In hypermodern media, noise and signal become indistinguishable. The constant bombardment of images and messages is no longer an interference in communication. It becomes the very substance of communication. This saturation ensures that no clear message can ever emerge, effectively neutralizing any potential for dissent or alternative perspectives. Baudrillard highlights that in this media environment, scandal and transparency function as part of the same system. Scandals are presented as revelations, moments where the truth supposedly pierces the veil. However, these spectacles actually reinforce the system by simulating accountability and openness while distracting from deeper structural issues. By endlessly confessing and exposing, media institutions appear honest, but in reality, they simply manage and recycle signs to maintain the illusion of meaning. Finally, he reflects on the political implications of this implosion. Traditional forms of political engagement, debates, protests, movements, are absorbed into the media circuit and stripped of transformative power. Political events become media events, judged not by their impact on society, but by their spectacle value. In this environment, politics becomes another genre of entertainment, and the citizen becomes a spectator. In sum, the implosion of meaning in the media diagnoses a profound shift in contemporary culture. The collapse of meaning through its saturation, the replacement of reality with spectacle, and the transformation of participation into simulation. Baudrillard's analysis reveals how the very tools that promise to connect and inform us end up isolating and pacifying us, leaving behind a shimmering surface of signs where meaning has silently imploded. Chapter 9. Absolute Advertising, Ground Zero Advertising. In Absolute Advertising, Ground Zero Advertising, Baudrillard examines the evolution of advertising from a manipulative strategy aimed at persuasion to a total environment in which advertising becomes the very condition of communication and social life. He explores how advertising moves beyond its original purpose to become a pervasive system that shapes not just consumption, but meaning itself. Baudrillard begins by outlining the classic function of advertising as a tool to create desire and sell products. In earlier forms, advertising operated through techniques of persuasion, emphasizing utility, quality, or symbolic association. Consumers were assumed to be rational or semi-rational subjects who could be influenced to make choices. However, Baudrillard suggests that this model is now outdated. In hypermodern society, advertising no longer simply persuades, it structures reality. Rather than manipulating needs, it creates a universe in which everything is already promotional. Advertising is no longer about specific messages, but about generating a continuous atmosphere of seduction. It merges with media, architecture, urban spaces, and social interactions, becoming an ambient condition rather than a discrete intervention. Baudrillard introduces the idea of absolute advertising, referring to a state where advertising achieves total transparency and saturation. In this state, there is no longer any distance between the message and its reception, nor between subject and object. The consumer is no longer addressed as an autonomous decision-maker, but as a participant in a seamless circuit of signs. Advertising, in this sense, is no longer external to the object, it is fused with it. He contrasts this with ground zero advertising, a metaphor for the point at which advertising collapses into pure communication, losing even the pretense of persuasion. At ground zero, advertising no longer needs to convince or seduce because everything is already an advertisement, and every object or experience has already been commodified in advance. There is no residual space left for critique or alternative meanings. Baudrillard emphasizes that this condition marks the transition from a society of production to a society of consumption and simulation. In a production-oriented society, advertising was an accessory to the economic system. In a simulation-oriented society, advertising becomes the main driver, shaping values, desires, and social relations. It is no longer about selling objects, but about producing social codes and lifestyles. He also notes the paradox that as advertising becomes more total, it becomes less meaningful in the traditional sense. Messages proliferate, images multiply, but they no longer carry distinct content. Instead, they circulate as empty forms, signals that confirm participation in a shared symbolic system. The purpose of advertising is no longer to differentiate, but to absorb all differences into a smooth continuum of exchange. Baudrillard warns that in this environment, resistance becomes difficult, if not impossible. Traditional forms of critique depended on an external standpoint, a position outside the system from which to evaluate or oppose it. In the world of absolute advertising, no such exterior exists. Everything, including dissent, is preemptively commodified and integrated into the promotional flow. He suggests that the final effect of absolute advertising is the erosion of meaning itself. By flooding the social space with continuous messaging, advertising neutralizes content, turning communication into a pure operational code. People no longer relate to products, ideas, or each other through genuine symbolic exchange, but through prepackaged signs that function autonomously. In sum, absolute advertising, ground zero advertising, explores the transformation of advertising from a manipulative art to an all-encompassing system that defines contemporary reality. Baudrillard's analysis reveals a society where advertising has become the ground of social existence itself, leaving no space for authentic meaning or resistance. The result is a hyper-real environment where seduction is continuous and all distinctions dissolve into a single promotional surface. Chapter 10. Clone Story. In Clone Story, Baudrillard uses the figure of the clone to explore the transformations in identity, reproduction, and difference in hypermodern society. He argues that cloning is not merely a scientific or biological concept, but a profound metaphor for the disappearance of singularity and the dominance of sameness under the logic of simulation. Baudrillard begins by describing the symbolic richness of sexual reproduction. Traditional reproduction involves chance, mixing, and the unpredictable emergence of new life. It is a process deeply tied to the symbolic order, involving difference, lineage, and the perpetuation of human uniqueness. In contrast, cloning bypasses this entire symbolic structure, offering pure replication without otherness or unpredictability. The clone, for Baudrillard, represents the perfect product of operational logic, an identical copy, fully controllable and devoid of mystery. In a world obsessed with control, security, and transparency, the clone embodies the fantasy of eliminating difference and risk. This desire to replicate perfectly mirrors broader social trends that aim to eradicate unpredictability and produce smooth, managed experiences. He extends the metaphor of cloning to cultural and social phenomena. In consumer culture, identities are no longer formed organically through lived experiences and encounters with difference. Instead, they are constructed from pre-packaged options, brand affiliations, and media images. Individuals become clones in the sense that they endlessly replicate circulating signs and models, losing their singular depth and originality. Baudrillard also discusses the relationship between cloning and the collapse of symbolic exchange. In traditional societies, symbolic exchange involved rituals, gifts, and social bonds that affirmed uniqueness and community ties. Cloning, by contrast, belongs to the logic of production and simulation. It eliminates the symbolic dimension of birth and generation, turning life into a technical process of replication. The clone is not born but produced, not a singular subject but a reproducible object. He warns that the dream of cloning reflects a deeper cultural pathology, the refusal of otherness and death. Cloning promises the extension of life and the preservation of identity beyond natural limits. It embodies the fantasy of mastering mortality and securing a stable, predictable future. However, Baudrillard argues that this dream is ultimately nihilistic. By eliminating chance and difference, cloning produces a world without true life, desire, or symbolic meaning. Baudrillard also links cloning to the rise of virtuality and digital culture. In the virtual world, identities and experiences are easily copied, shared, and reproduced. The self becomes a floating collection of profiles, images, and data points, endlessly replicable across platforms. The digital subject, like the biological clone, loses singularity and becomes part of an endless loop of sameness. Politically, Baudrillard sees the logic of cloning reflected in systems that prioritize security and control over freedom and spontaneity. Societies increasingly seek to regulate behavior, eliminate deviance, and produce compliant, predictable citizens, in effect to clone social subjects. This tendency threatens to eradicate spaces for resistance, creativity, and symbolic rupture. In closing, Baudrillard suggests that cloning is less a futuristic nightmare than a present reality at the level of culture and subjectivity. We already live in a cloned world, where difference is replaced by repetition, and life is reduced to operational continuity. The clone is thus a perfect symbol of hypermodern existence, a being without origin or destiny, caught in an endless process of self-replication without transcendence. In sum, Clone Story critiques the cultural obsession with replication and sameness. Baudrillard uses the figure of the clone to illustrate the decline of symbolic life, the loss of singularity, and the rise of a society that prefers copies to originals, control to chance, and continuity to transformation. Chapter 11. Holograms. In Holograms, the philosopher explores the hologram as a powerful metaphor for the logic of simulation and hyperreality that defines contemporary society. He examines how the hologram, as a technological and cultural object, exemplifies the desire for total representation and the elimination of absence or depth in favor of perfect surface. Baudrillard begins by describing the hologram as an image that offers a perfect illusion of three-dimensionality. Unlike traditional images or representations that acknowledge their flatness or partiality, the hologram aims to provide a total view, presenting an object as if it were fully present from all angles with no hidden dimensions. The hologram embodies the fantasy of transparency and complete visibility. He argues that this technological pursuit reflects a deeper cultural obsession, the desire to eliminate mystery, opacity, and otherness from experience. The hologram symbolizes a drive toward total simulation, a reality in which everything is visible, accessible, and controlled. In such a system, the play of appearances, shadows, and absences that once gave depth to reality is abolished. Baudrillard connects this to the transformation of social relations. In a society dominated by holographic logic, individuals become holographic themselves, presenting perfect, polished images rather than complex, opaque selves. Identity is performed as a flawless projection, curated for visibility and consumption. The depth of subjectivity, inner conflict, and genuine alterity are sacrificed to the smooth surface of self-presentation. He also discusses the implications for space and architecture. The hologram suggests a dissolution of physical boundaries. Space becomes transparent and fluid, no longer grounded in materiality or resistance. Buildings, cities, and even landscapes are designed to be experienced as continuous images, seamlessly integrated into the flow of media and consumption. The holographic city is one without shadows or hidden corners, a space of pure visibility. Baudrillard notes that this pursuit of total visibility leads to a paradoxical outcome, the disappearance of meaning. When everything is illuminated and rendered transparent, the symbolic richness that emerges from ambiguity and hiddenness vanishes. Meaning is not found in total exposure, but in the tension between presence and absence, visibility and invisibility. The holographic society, in its quest for total simulation, destroys the conditions for genuine meaning and symbolic exchange. He further warns that this logic extends into politics and culture. Political figures and cultural icons increasingly function as holograms, images without depth or substance, endlessly reproducible and devoid of authentic reference. They circulate as pure signs, detached from any concrete reality or moral grounding. The public engages with these holographic figures not as subjects with real agency, but as luminous surfaces to be admired, consumed, or discarded. Baudrillard ties the holographic metaphor to the broader technological imperative of virtuality. Virtual reality and immersive media push the holographic dream even further, promising experiences without gaps, mediation, or loss. Yet these experiences are simulations that reinforce detachment from the real, rather than facilitating authentic engagement with it. In closing, Baudrillard suggests that the hologram represents both a culmination and a dead end. It realizes the dream of total representation, but at the cost of erasing the very conditions that make reality meaningful and human existence rich. The hologram, as a metaphor, warns of a future in which life becomes a series of perfect images, endlessly projected and endlessly empty. In sum, Holograms offers a powerful critique of the contemporary obsession with transparency, perfection, and total simulation. Baudrillard uses the figure of the hologram to illuminate the dangers of a culture that seeks to replace depth and difference with pure surface, ultimately revealing the profound emptiness at the heart of hyperreal life. Chapter 12. In Crash, Baudrillard draws on J.G. Ballard's novel Crash to explore the intersection of technology, violence, and desire in hypermodern society. He examines how car crashes, rather than representing pure accidents or tragedies, become eroticized events that reveal deeper truths about the human relationship to technology and the body. Baudrillard begins by describing the characters in Crash, who become sexually obsessed with car accidents, merging the thrill of speed and danger with bodily injury. For these characters, the car crash is not a failure or breakdown, but a new form of experience that fuses flesh and machine, life and death. The crash becomes a symbolic act, a ritual that transcends traditional moral and social boundaries. He argues that this fascination reflects a cultural shift in which technology and violence are no longer opposed but intimately linked. Modern technology, instead of serving purely functional or rational purposes, becomes an extension of human drives and fantasies. The automobile is not simply a means of transport, but an object of desire, a site where speed, power, and mortality intersect in a uniquely seductive way. Baudrillard suggests that crashes reveal the breakdown of symbolic systems that once mediated violence and death. In earlier societies, violence was ritualized, controlled through symbolic acts such as sacrifice or combat with strict codes. In hypermodern society, these symbolic structures collapse, and violence returns in raw, spectacular form. The crash embodies this return. It is immediate, unmediated, and yet integrated into the system as a consumable spectacle. He also discusses how the crash represents a fusion of human and technological bodies, reflecting the broader trend toward hybridization in contemporary life. The body is no longer a purely organic entity, but becomes a surface to be inscribed by technological impacts. This transformation illustrates the loss of bodily integrity and the emergence of a post-human subjectivity defined by interfaces and collisions, rather than inner essence. Baudrillard connects this logic to the broader fascination with catastrophe and disaster in media and culture. Crashes, explosions, and other violent disruptions are endlessly circulated as images, turning destruction into a form of entertainment and erotic pleasure. The society of the spectacle absorbs even the most shocking events, transforming them into consumable signs that stimulate rather than horrify. He further argues that the crash symbolizes the ultimate realization of operational logic, a moment where the system pushes itself to its limits and reveals its own death drive. In this sense, the crash is not an anomaly, but a fulfillment of technological destiny. The merging of man and machine in the moment of impact demonstrates a collective desire to transcend boundaries and enter a new, fatal order of existence. Baudrillard sees in the crash a metaphor for the fate of modern subjectivity. The individual, once conceived as an autonomous, sovereign self, is now fragmented and recombined with technology and media. Identity becomes something to be shattered and reconstructed rather than protected or unified. The crash exposes this fragmentation in its most violent and literal form. In closing, Baudrillard suggests that the eroticism of the crash reflects a deeper nihilism at the core of contemporary culture. By eroticizing destruction and merging it with desire, society reveals its fascination with the end of the human as traditionally understood. Rather than resisting technological violence, people are seduced by it, seeking meaning and pleasure in the very forces that threaten their existence. In sum, Crash uses the metaphor of the car accident to explore the dissolution of symbolic structures, the merging of human and machine, and the seduction of violence in hypermodern society. Baudrillard's analysis reveals a culture that no longer seeks to avoid catastrophe, but embraces it as a site of ecstatic experience and ultimate truth. Chapter 13: Simulacra and Science Fiction. In Simulacra and Science Fiction, the author explores the relationship between science fiction and the concept of simulation, arguing that science fiction, SF, is no longer capable of transcending or critiquing reality because reality itself has become science fiction. He examines how traditional science fiction, which once provided imaginative other worlds and future scenarios, has been overtaken by the logic of simulacra and hyperreality. Baudrillard begins by outlining the classical role of science fiction as a genre that constructs alternative worlds, distant futures, or alien civilizations. These fictional constructs served as mirrors, allowing society to question its assumptions and imagine different possibilities. However, in a world dominated by simulation, such distance and alterity collapse. We no longer need fictional other worlds because our reality has already absorbed the logic of science fiction. He argues that in hyperreality, the distinction between reality and fiction dissolves. Contemporary reality is infused with models, codes, and simulations that anticipate and reproduce events before they happen. Rather than speculating about future technologies or distant planets, science fiction now simply mirrors the present, exaggerating trends that already saturate daily life. The imaginary no longer serves as a space of escape or critique, but becomes an extension of operational logic. Baudrillard notes that contemporary science fiction tends to obsess over technological detail and realism, constructing meticulously plausible worlds. This drive toward hyperrealism reveals an anxiety about the loss of the real. Instead of exploring the unknown, these fictions reproduce reality with even more precision, reinforcing the dominance of codes and simulations rather than offering genuine estrangement. He distinguishes between traditional science fiction and what he calls simulation fiction. While classical SF posited imaginary worlds and futures as possible alternatives, simulation fiction operates by dissolving boundaries between fiction and reality. It exposes how reality itself has become a coded, reproducible script. In simulation fiction, the imaginary is not a separate dimension but part of the same continuum as the real, preventing any true exteriority or escape. Baudrillard uses examples from media and technology to illustrate this collapse. He refers to Disneyland as a simulated microcosm that makes the rest of America appear real by contrast, while itself functioning as a hyper-real space. Similarly, he argues that media spectacles and virtual experiences absorb all forms of fiction and reality into a continuous flow, erasing the ability to distinguish or critique. He further discusses cloning and genetic engineering as examples of the simulation logic overtaking biological life. These technologies do not create monsters or hybrids in the classical science fiction sense. Rather, they replicate and extend the code of life itself, embodying the ultimate triumph of simulation over the unpredictable. The dream of creating life without difference or otherness reflects the system's desire for total control and predictability. Baudrillard warns that in this context, the traditional subversive or utopian power of science fiction is neutralized. By mirroring reality rather than providing alternatives, science fiction becomes complicit with the system it once critiqued. Dystopias are no longer warnings but aesthetic styles, marketed and consumed as entertainment without any capacity to disrupt or inspire change. Even radical narratives are preemptively absorbed into the circuits of sign exchange. He concludes that in the age of simulation, fiction cannot imagine other worlds because there is no longer an other to posit. Reality itself is already hyper-real, endlessly reproducible and manipulable. Science fiction, instead of opening new horizons, simply documents the logic of the present, a logic that extends beyond any single narrative or imaginative boundary. In sum, Simulacra and Science Fiction critiques the inability of contemporary science fiction to challenge or transcend hyperreality. Baudrillard shows how, in a world saturated by codes and simulations, even our most imaginative genres have become reflections of the system rather than acts of creative resistance. Science fiction loses its radical edge and merges seamlessly with the operational order of signs and simulations that define modern existence. Chapter 14: The Animals, Territory and Metamorphoses. In The Animals, Territory and Metamorphoses, Baudrillard explores the shifting relationship between humans and animals as a reflection of broader cultural and symbolic transformations. He argues that animals, once integrated into human symbolic systems, have been reduced to operational objects within modernity, signaling the loss of meaningful difference and the triumph of simulation. Baudrillard begins by reflecting on how traditional societies understood animals through symbolic and ritualistic frameworks. Animals were not just resources or companions, they were totems, spiritual figures, and partners in mythological narratives. These relationships reaffirmed a sense of continuity and exchange between human beings and the natural world, embedding animals within a shared symbolic order. In modern society, however, animals are increasingly stripped of their symbolic resonance and transformed into objects of domestication, consumption, and entertainment. Whether in zoos, circuses, or as pets, animals are confined and managed, turned into spectacles or commodities. The zoo, in particular, exemplifies this transformation. It removes animals from their territories and recontextualizes them as objects of display. This signals a shift from a world of meaningful exchanges to one dominated by operational control and sign value. Baudrillard emphasizes that the disappearance of the animal's symbolic dimension corresponds with the collapse of human subjectivity into operational and commodified roles. Just as animals are reduced to mere functions, so too are humans redefined as consumers, data points, and social profiles. The animal's loss of autonomy and symbolic power mirrors the human subject's loss of depth and authentic selfhood. He further discusses the metamorphosis of animals through genetic manipulation and industrial breeding. Rather than respecting their alterity, contemporary practices seek to optimize animals for productivity, aesthetic standards, or entertainment value. This technological intervention erases the unpredictability and wildness of the animal, turning it into a manufactured product. The once mysterious and sacred animal becomes a blank surface upon which human desires and fantasies are projected. Baudrillard links this logic to the broader environmental crisis. The instrumentalization of animals parallels the exploitation and destruction of nature at large. Ecosystems are destabilized, species are driven to extinction, and the natural world is increasingly seen only as a resource for human use. In losing the animal as a symbolic counterpart, humanity also loses its own symbolic horizon, severing ties to the deeper rhythms of life and death. He also examines the psychological and cultural consequences of this severance. The absence of the animal other eliminates a crucial site for confronting human finitude and otherness. Historically, animals served as mirrors and metaphors for human instincts, mortality, and desires. Their disappearance from symbolic life impoverishes human self-understanding, reducing existential questions to technical or operational problems. Baudrillard suggests that this metamorphosis of animals reflects a larger shift toward a world where all forms of otherness are neutralized. In the hyper-real order, difference is not engaged but absorbed, managed, and repackaged as style or spectacle. Animals, like cultural differences and individual identities, become surfaces to be manipulated rather than genuine interlocutors in a shared world. In closing, he warns that the transformation of animals signals a deeper alienation that extends beyond ecology or ethics. It represents the collapse of symbolic exchange and the erosion of any external reference point from which to critique or renew human existence. The disappearance of the animal thus symbolizes the final stage of a culture that privileges simulation and operational control over mystery, unpredictability, and true relationality. In sum, The Animals, Territory and Metamorphoses critiques the reduction of animals to operational objects, using their fate as a powerful metaphor for the decline of symbolic life and the human capacity for meaningful otherness. Baudrillard invites us to see the loss of the animal not as a marginal issue, but as a central symptom of a world increasingly devoid of depth and genuine encounter. Chapter 15. The Remainder. In The Remainder, Baudrillard investigates what is left over in a society obsessed with total integration, control, and operational logic. He focuses on the concept of the remainder as a figure for what escapes the system of production and simulation, the residues, failures, and excesses that cannot be fully absorbed. Baudrillard begins by explaining how traditional societies dealt with remainder through symbolic exchange, rituals, and sacrifices. These practices acknowledged waste, excess, and death as inevitable parts of life and transformed them into meaningful collective experiences. The remainder had a role. It was ritually processed and reintegrated into the social fabric as part of a cyclical understanding of life. In contrast, modern technological and capitalist systems seek to eliminate remainder altogether. Hypermodernity is characterized by the ideal of total circulation and efficiency. Nothing should be wasted. Nothing should stand outside the system. In economic terms, surplus production and overconsumption become the norm, but they generate their own forms of symbolic and material remainder: poverty, environmental destruction, alienation. Baudrillard describes how the remainder persists despite efforts to suppress it. The marginalized, the excluded, and the failures of the system embody this remainder. These groups do not fit neatly into the logic of productivity and simulation, and thus become the invisible or repressed aspects of society. Rather than confronting or integrating them, society tends to hide or displace them, often turning them into spectacles for moral consumption or charity. He suggests that the remainder is not merely a leftover, but a necessary structural element of the system. The illusion of totality and perfection relies on the existence of something left outside. Without remainder, the system would collapse into pure tautology, losing the tension and negativity that sustain it. In this sense, remainder becomes a kind of unconscious for the social order, a repository of unresolved contradictions and suppressed truths. Baudrillard connects this to environmental and technological excess. Waste products, toxic residues, and other ecological remainders symbolize the inability of the system to fully control its outputs. Efforts to manage or recycle waste mirror efforts to reintegrate social remainders, but these efforts often fail to address the underlying dynamics of overproduction and hyperconsumption. On a psychological level, Baudrillard suggests that individuals also experience remainder within themselves: unassimilated desires, failures, and traumas that resist integration into the smooth narrative of the self as consumer and producer. The culture of self-improvement and therapy promises to eliminate these internal remainders, but they persist, manifesting as anxiety, depression, or breakdowns that puncture the facade of wholeness. Baudrillard also points to the aesthetic dimension of remainder. In art and literature, remainder can appear as gaps, silences, or disruptive elements that resist closure and smooth interpretation. True artistic or symbolic acts engage with the remainder rather than seeking to eliminate it. They open spaces for otherness and negativity that challenge the operational logic of the system. He warns that the ultimate danger is the total elimination of remainder, which would signify the death of meaning itself. A society without waste, without failure, and without residue would also be a society without symbolic depth or vitality. The remainder provides a necessary margin of unpredictability and freedom, a space from which critique and renewal can emerge. In sum, the remainder offers a meditation on what escapes the totalizing forces of hypermodern society. Baudrillard reveals how remainder functions as both a structural necessity and a site of potential resistance. By attending to what is excluded or left behind, we glimpse the limits of the system and the possibilities for rethinking meaning and value beyond operational logic. Chapter 16. The Spiraling Cadaver. In The Spiraling Cadaver, Baudrillard examines how contemporary society manages death and the dead body, transforming them from sacred and symbolic elements into operational and aesthetic objects. He argues that this shift reflects a broader cultural logic that seeks to control and neutralize everything, even the ultimate negativity of death. Baudrillard begins by describing how, in traditional societies, death occupied a central symbolic role. The dead body was surrounded by rituals, mourning practices, and collective ceremonies that gave death meaning and integrated it into the social fabric. Death was a moment of rupture and renewal, marking both an end and a transition. It reaffirmed communal bonds and the cyclical nature of life. In modernity, however, death is increasingly denied and hidden. The dead body is quickly removed from public view, processed in sanitized, medicalized spaces, and presented as clean and peaceful in funeral homes. This reflects a profound refusal to confront the reality of death. Rather than serving as a site for collective mourning and symbolic exchange, the cadaver becomes an object to be managed and controlled. Baudrillard uses the metaphor of the spiraling cadaver to describe how the dead body is no longer allowed to decay naturally and symbolically re-enter the cycle of life. Instead, it is preserved, circulated, and displayed in ways that prevent true mourning and symbolic closure. Anatomical exhibits, medical dissection, and even artistic uses of bodies turn the cadaver into a spectacle or educational object, stripping it of its mystery and sacredness. He links this transformation to the broader cultural obsession with transparency, preservation, and the elimination of negativity. The refusal to accept death's finality parallels the refusal to accept other forms of loss, failure, and limitation in hypermodern society. Everything must be made visible, controllable, and operational, including the ultimate event that once stood as a limit to human mastery. Baudrillard also explores how this denial of death impacts the living subject. By refusing to acknowledge death, individuals are denied the opportunity to confront their own finitude and mortality. The result is a culture of pseudo-immortality, where aging is medicalized and youth is fetishized. Death becomes an external technical problem rather than an integral part of human existence and meaning. He suggests that the spiraling cadaver symbolizes a deeper collapse of symbolic structures. Without rituals and symbolic acts to process death, society loses one of its essential mechanisms for renewing meaning and reaffirming bonds. Mourning is privatized and psychologized rather than enacted collectively, further isolating individuals and weakening social cohesion. Baudrillard also points to the commodification of death in funeral industries and medical institutions. Death is packaged and sold as a service, its aesthetic carefully managed to align with cultural expectations of serenity and cleanliness. This commodification is another expression of the operational logic that governs contemporary life, turning even the most profound human experiences into consumable and manageable products. In the end, Baudrillard warns that this handling of death reflects a culture unable to tolerate negativity and otherness. The spiraling cadaver becomes a figure for a society that refuses symbolic exchange, preferring endless circulation and preservation over rupture and renewal. By transforming the cadaver into an operational object, society loses the depth and mystery that once made death a source of collective meaning. In sum, the spiraling cadaver critiques the modern approach to death as a denial of both individual and collective finitude. Baudrillard reveals how the management and aestheticization of the dead body illustrate the broader cultural obsession with control and the refusal of symbolic processes. Through this analysis, he exposes a civilization increasingly unable to confront its own limits and mortality. Chapter 17. Value's Last Tango. In Value's Last Tango, the philosopher examines the transformation and ultimate crisis of value in contemporary society. He argues that traditional notions of value, whether economic, moral, or symbolic, have collapsed under the weight of hyperreality and simulation, leading to a cultural environment where value itself becomes a floating, unstable sign. Baudrillard begins by discussing classical economic value systems, which were historically rooted in labor, scarcity, and utility. In these systems, value was linked to production and the tangible effort behind commodities. Even in Marxist critiques, value retained a material basis, grounded in labor and exchange. However, with the rise of consumer capitalism, this foundation began to erode. In the current era of simulation, value no longer depends on material reality, but is instead generated through sign value, the value things possess as signs in a system of differences. Objects derive their worth not from intrinsic qualities or utility, but from their capacity to signify status, lifestyle, or distinction. A luxury car, for example, signifies wealth and taste more than it fulfills a practical transportation need. Baudrillard suggests that we are now witnessing the last tango of value, a final dance in which value continues to circulate frenetically even as its foundations dissolve. Markets, fashion trends, and cultural phenomena move in a perpetual swirl of fluctuations, with value endlessly rising and falling without any real anchor. The spectacle of value becomes an end in itself, detached from any reference to substance or truth. He also addresses the implications for art and culture. In the traditional aesthetic paradigm, value was linked to authenticity, originality, and the artist's intention. Today, however, art is caught up in the same circulation of sign values. It is no longer about challenging conventions or revealing truths, but about generating attention and exchange value. The artwork becomes a brand, a speculative investment, or a meme, stripped of depth and reduced to a node in the network of signs. Baudrillard extends this analysis to ethics and moral values. Justice, freedom, and human rights are transformed into slogans and advertising claims, emptied of concrete content. They circulate as free-floating signifiers, used to legitimize actions and policies rather than to guide genuine ethical engagement. In this process, moral values lose their force and become part of the spectacle. He also critiques the idea of resistance within this system. Attempts at critique or subversion are rapidly absorbed and repurposed as fashion or marketing. Radical aesthetics, underground movements, and revolutionary slogans are commodified and turned into profitable trends. In this way, even opposition becomes a part of the last tango, dancing to the same rhythm as the values it aims to challenge. Baudrillard warns that this collapse of value does not lead to nihilism in the classical sense. Instead of a void, we get an excess, a hyperinflation of meanings and signs that simulate value while masking its absence. This condition produces a kind of vertigo, a dizzying spectacle in which everything is valuable and nothing truly is. In closing, Baudrillard evokes the image of a tango, a dance that is elegant, passionate, yet ultimately ritualistic and circular. The dance of value continues endlessly, captivating participants even as the music of substance and meaning has faded. This metaphor underscores the tragicomic nature of contemporary culture, caught in an ecstatic celebration of value that has lost all ground. In sum, Value's Last Tango explores the fate of value in a society ruled by simulation and sign exchange. Baudrillard reveals how value's last performance, while lively and seductive, ultimately signals the disappearance of substance and the triumph of empty circulation. The chapter stands as a critical reflection on the end of value as a meaningful measure in human life. Chapter 18. On Nihilism. Baudrillard explores the cultural and philosophical condition of nihilism in contemporary hypermodern society. He argues that nihilism today is no longer the dramatic, destructive force described by Nietzsche or traditional existentialists. Instead, it has become a quiet, pervasive state embedded within the logic of simulation and sign exchange. Baudrillard begins by distinguishing between active and passive nihilism. Classical active nihilism, as Nietzsche described it, represented a radical negation of existing values, driven by the will to overcome and create new values. It was an energetic, almost heroic revolt against meaninglessness. Passive nihilism, in contrast, is characterized by resignation and apathy in the face of the loss of meaning, a surrender rather than an act of creation. He suggests that contemporary nihilism transcends this distinction. It is no longer about the dramatic destruction of values, but about their silent evaporation. In a society where everything becomes a sign and circulates in an endless flow, values lose their weight and gravity. They do not collapse spectacularly, but dissolve into indifference and superficiality. Meaning is not violently rejected, it simply becomes irrelevant. Baudrillard links this condition to the triumph of simulation. When reality is replaced by simulacra, there is no longer a referent against which to measure truth, authenticity, or value. The endless reproduction of signs creates a world where everything appears possible, but nothing truly matters. This proliferation of images and codes results in what he describes as a desert of the real, a landscape of hollow surfaces without depth or substance. He also explores how this nihilism manifests in culture and politics. In cultural production, art no longer aims to reveal truth or provoke radical reflection. Instead, it becomes part of the system of signs, producing endless variations and spectacles that simulate creativity without risk or consequence. Political discourse follows a similar pattern. Debates, campaigns, and ideologies circulate as empty signifiers, disconnected from genuine commitment or transformation. Baudrillard observes that in this nihilistic condition, even critique becomes a simulation. Acts of resistance, subversion, or irony are quickly absorbed into the system, turned into marketable styles or commodified gestures. The system preempts opposition by integrating it, ensuring that nothing can stand truly outside or against it. In this way, nihilism is no longer an external threat, but a core feature of the operational logic of hypermodernity. He argues that contemporary nihilism is also expressed in the drive toward transparency, hypervisibility, and total information. The obsession with exposing everything, rendering all processes and subjects fully visible, paradoxically empties them of meaning. The more we know and see, the less we understand or care. In this state of total exposure, mystery, depth, and the possibility of symbolic exchange disappear. Baudrillard further suggests that this nihilism does not lead to despair or violence in the traditional sense. Rather, it produces a culture of calm, smooth operationality, where everything continues to function without purpose or passion. People continue to work, consume, and perform social roles, but these actions lack symbolic resonance or existential weight. Life becomes an endless loop of activities devoid of finality or rupture. Despite this bleak diagnosis, Baudrillard hints that there may be a form of freedom in this condition. By acknowledging the radical absence of meaning, one might escape the compulsion to produce false meanings or cling to exhausted values. This fatal strategy involves embracing the desert, accepting the play of signs without nostalgia for lost truths. It is not a heroic solution, but a lucid recognition of the contemporary condition. In closing, Baudrillard presents nihilism not as a dramatic philosophical crisis, but as an ambient atmosphere of hypermodern life. It is a silent, pervasive force that shapes subjectivity, culture, and politics from within. Rather than heralding collapse or revolution, nihilism today ensures the smooth continuation of the system, turning even emptiness into a mode of operational efficiency. In sum, On Nihilism offers a profound meditation on the subtle, pervasive nihilism that characterizes the age of simulation. Baudrillard reveals how meaning dissolves not through violent negation, but through endless circulation, leaving behind a world of shimmering surfaces and silent resignation.